Welcome to the ninth episode of the second season of the MediCrew Masterclasses. And today we are going to discuss about the science behind human gender and sexuality. As usual, you can always post your queries in the chat box, and I'll be very glad to respond to them. And as has been the tradition of the MediCrew Masterclasses, we'll start with a few questions. So let us start. This is your first question. A child is born with a pair of testes as primary sexual organs. So, which is the correct statement regarding the child? The next question is, if an individual is born with ovaries and feels that she is a girl, then she can be described as. The third question, a 12-year-old boy is romantically and physically attracted to boys only. He visits your clinic for his confusion. What would be the best step? The fourth one, homosexuality is considered to be a developmental disorder by World Health Organization. True or false? And the last question before we start our discussion, we may normalize homosexuality if we can discover a gay gene. So do you think this statement is true or false? So let us start the session. Because we'll be using a number of jargons and terminologies in our session, let us start with some very basic terminologies. There are certain words that we should be very clear about their meaning in order to progress with today's discussion. These words apparently may sound very similar, but they have different connotations. So, there are certain terminologies when we talk about sexuality. One is the biological sex. Sometimes it is also called the anatomical sex. What is biological sex? Biological sex is the primary sexual organ that someone is born with. It is the sex assigned at birth. And by primary sexual organs, we mean the gonads. So if a child is born with testes, then the child is biologically male. If a child is born with ovaries, then the child is biologically female. If a child is born with ovotestis, then the child may be biologically intersex or androgynous. Whereas gender is something entirely different. Gender can be described as the social role of being masculine or feminine, which means that if a person after growing up identifies with the male stereotypes in the society, then the person can be said to belong to a masculine gender. And if the person recognizes with the feminine stereotypes of the society, then the person can be said to belong to the female gender. Of course, it is not always necessary that you have to belong to a stereotype. So you can also be gender queer as well as gender fluid. There are three important attributes when it comes to defining sexuality of an individual. One is the sexual orientation. Sexual orientation means to which biological sex or gender are you attracted. For example, are you attracted to the same sex? Are you attracted to the opposite sex? To both the sexes in same or variable proportion, or to none of the sexes? So answer to this question, to which sex are you attracted, defines your sexual orientation. Sexual behavior and identity are different from sexual orientation. Sexual behavior means the actual sexual act that you perform. So, do you have physical intimacy with the same sex person, opposite sex person, with both, or with none? And identity is, how do you recognize yourself as homosexual, as bisexual, as asexual, or as heterosexual? You might wonder at this point of time that won't all these three be same in the same person? Many a times it may not be same in the same person because of so many socio-economic reasons. For example, a person who is bisexual and is attracted to both males and females may not express the homosexual attribute because of the fear of the society. So he or she may wear a heterosexual identity whereas having a bisexual orientation. They may also marry someone from the opposite sex and lead a heterosexual behavior. So the orientation, behavior, and identity can be the same in a very idealized society where there is no stigma. But in presence of stigma, in presence of misinformation, there is a chance that the three may not be exactly the same. Now, as I told you, gender refers to the roles of belonging to the male or female stereotypes. And if the biological sex and the gender are same, then we call the person cisgender. So that is like calling someone a masculine male. And similarly, a cisgender female will be a feminine female. When a person transcends the boundary or does not fit into the exact gender role as is guided by the biological sex, then the person would be called transgender. For example, a masculine female or a feminine male. And if a person is not at all confined within the categories of the gender stereotypes, they may call themselves gender fluid. It's very interesting to see that the stereotypes can also vary in the same place across time and at the same time across cultures and geography. So, what is considered to be a masculine dress in Scotland may not be a masculine dress in India or China. So, the same stereotype can become masculine in one country or one space and become feminine in the other space. That is why gender is always very relative. And it's often very common to say that there are as many genders as many human beings there are on this earth. As I was saying, that sexual orientation refers to which particular sex or gender we are attracted to. So, if we are attracted to the members of the same sex, the individuals are called homosexual. Conventionally, male homosexuals have been called gay and female homosexuals have been called lesbian, although the word gay is sometimes used as an umbrella term for homosexuality. When people are attracted erotically as well as physically to individuals of the opposite sex, then they're said to be heterosexual. And a common colloquial term for heterosexual is straight, also pointing towards the normativity that has been assigned to heterosexuality as a privilege. Bisexual individuals are attracted to people of both the sexes, but not necessarily in the same proportion. The proportion can vary. Asexual people are not physically or sexually attracted to anyone, but that does not also mean that they are not romantic. So, a person who is asexual is not necessarily aromantic in nature. We often come across this word queer. So, what does the word queer mean in the Urban Dictionary? The word queer can be interpreted in a different way by different people. We know that the word queer in the early times was used as a derogatory slur to represent the oddity of being non heterosexual. The word has been reclaimed in history and is now being used as a very positive connotation to represent someone who is not mainstream. So, even a heterosexual person can call themselves queer if they fit not into the generalized stereotypes of heterosexuality. Another very close word questioning is someone who is still reassessing their sexual orientation or gender. Now, today's topic is not about the social activism of gender and sexuality. Today's topic is about the science of gender and sexuality. But the fundamental question is, from when did the uh, issues of sexuality and gender come under the domain of science? Something that is very interesting is that when in the early part of the 19th century, the power of the church was declining and the European culture was moving towards a more secular way of making laws, then gradually what was seen as a sin gradually started becoming a disease. Now, this at that point of time was considered to be a positive step because sin is something that you commit. A disease happens to you and you suffer from a disease. So people thought that if we replace the word sin with disease, it actually gives that individual more dignity by saying that the individual is actually a sufferer and not someone who is committing the sin. However, it also unnecessarily medicalized something which was not medical to start with. This is something that we must understand before we start our discussion on the biological basis of gender and sexuality. When we say that something is abnormal, it's usually based on certain kinds of statistical studies. It's based on case control or cohort studies showing an increased amount of pathology or morbidity in one group compared to the other group. Homosexuality was never medicalized based on studies. It was a direct transformation. The word sin got transformed into the word disease. So there was no reason why homosexuality is abnormal. But because it was called a disease, people started to find cures for the disease. And this is how gradually the pathologization and the museumization of homosexuality started to happen. Two important attributes that were criticized by the Bible and then became diseases, so to say, were masturbation and homosexuality. I'll just give you some historical anecdotes to show how gradually science took over this whole notion of sexuality being a disease model. We know that religion once defined the morally acceptable sexual behavior in a society. In the later half of the 19th century, medical professionals became interested in behavioral domains that was previously the preserve of the religious authorities. So they started talking about criminal psychology, about alcoholism, about drugs, and about sex. The long tradition of representing an illness as a punishment for sin was also continued when sexual behavior was medicalized. We can recall the action of the then physician William Acton. William Acton prescribed against masturbation and he invented a condition that he called spermatorrhea or the flow or loss of semen. So you can see in his book, he has drawn this kind of exaggerated and grotesque images of effects of masturbation to prove that masturbation is wrong in this book called Boyhood's Perils and Manhood's Curse. It's also very interesting to see that there was also devices that were designed to discourage masturbation. And this is one example of how certain attributes which are physiological started to be seen as diseases. Again, not based on any sort of scientific study, but being morally conducted and with morality being transformed into scientific doctrines. This is where we understand that science, law, and religion always influence each other, whether we like it or not. What we consider as a pure elixir of science also comes with a pinch of legal and religious implication. This is because human beings are social animals. So, whatever we preach scientifically is also to some extent morally acceptable to us and legally valid for us. And this gives us to this big dilemma that whatever is legal may not be normal by science, and whatever is a sin may not be a disease by science. If we give a brief outline of the timeline of research before we go into the genetics and the endocrine basis of gender and sexuality, the modern study started somewhere around the 1948s. Dr. Alfred Kinsey was a renowned zoologist in the United States, and he published the first Kinsey report on sexual behaviors of human male. The second report on sexual behavior of human female came out in 1953. It was also in 1957 that the Society for Scientific Study of Sexuality was founded to encourage the rigorous systematic study of sexuality. 1973 is a landmark moment in the entire medical history of sexuality. The American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But again, understand, it did not just come from scientific studies because it was not pathologized based on scientific studies. This is where science and society intertangle with each other and start influencing each other. In 1977, the Bay Area Physicians for Human Rights was founded in San Francisco. This can be traced back as the first medical LGBT group that was founded in the history. In 1981, the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association was founded as the American Association for Physicians of Human Rights. And in 1987, the diagnosis of ego-dystonic sexual orientation was dropped from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. In 1990s, World Health Organization replaced the categorization of homosexuality as a mental illness. So currently we cannot make a diagnosis of homosexuality in psychiatry because it is not a disorder. In 1991, the American Psychoanalytic Association issued a statement allowing training of gay psychoanalysts. 1992 was also very hallmark. The American Psychoanalytic Association prohibited discrimination against gay people while selecting teaching faculty. And also in 1993, we got the probably first paper on the genetic component of sexual orientation. So what is it that we know till date about the biology of sexual orientation? Is sexuality a product of nature or a product of nurture? Studies that have been done on the postmortem specimens of human brain show that there is an area called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. This area in mammal show a sexual dimorphism. That means they are different in males and females. What was interesting is in human being, they were also found to be different in heterosexual men and homosexual men. But these kind of studies have the disadvantage of not being able to analyze the cause-effect relationship. We do not know that because the interstitial nucleus of anterior hypothalamus is different, because of that a person is straight or gay, or is it because a person has led a gay life or a straight life that the nucleus has become large or small. So the cause-effect relationship definitely does not come from the neural correlates, but it does show that there might be some biological basis or neural hardwiring related to the sexual orientation. Levy's experiment was a very important experiment, probably the first of its kind, on the gay brain hypothesis. A lot of studies have also tried to find out whether hormones, particularly in the prenatal period, while the child is still in the mother's womb, influences the outcome of the pregnancy as determining the sexual orientation. Again, these studies have been largely inconclusive. But it is seen that the hormone levels definitely affect the size of the sexually dimorphic nucleus. So indirectly suggesting that probably there is an influence of hormones prenatally on the sexual orientation of individuals. A recent review of literature suggests that this may be more in case of females than in case of men. Female children who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, of course, have greater androgen exposure in the prenatal life. It is found that a large percentage of them actually have same-sex attraction. But out of the people who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, again, the majority are heterosexual and not homosexual. So these studies, again, are very conflicting. and they do not give us any pinpointed evidence of endocrine basis of human sexuality. Studies in the adults show that uh, being transgender, being gay, or being bisexual is not at all correlated with the gonadotropin levels or hormone levels of the body. If a heterosexual male is given estrogen injection, it can only change the sexual characteristics of the body and not the sexual orientation. If a heterosexual female is given testosterone injection, it is again the physical body that changes and not the psychology. So in adult life, there is definitely no role of hormones in determining sexual orientation. There is one very interesting case study that I would like to discuss here. This is known as a quasi-experimental study. That is an experiment that was not meant to be an experiment. It was seen that in the late part of the 1900s, there were boys who were exposed to the typical level of androgens because they had the testes, but were reassigned as females. This is because there were surgical accidents to the genitalia or because of some anatomical condition called cloacal exstrophy, where a malformation occurs to the penis. So socially, they were groomed as females. Despite that, when they grew up, they had strong attraction to the females as adults. So, probably indicating that if the brain is hardwired to be heterosexual, it cannot be really changed by the way you groom someone. Genetic and epigenetic studies have shown that there is a greater concordance rate, that is, similarity rate of same sex orientation among monozygotic twins. But the effects are not much. It's barely more than 50%. Again, so the genetic and epigenetic studies are also not effective in proving that there is a definite biological correlation. Another interesting study is known as fraternal birth order effect. It is seen that if a lady is bearing male children consecutively, then as the generation progresses, the later boys have a higher percentage of becoming gay. Although this has been proven in certain studies, but its biological basis is not clearly known. That the endocrine theory failed miserably comes from again a very funny experiment that was done during the Cold War. This is called the gay bomb concept. So the United States Air Force came up with this bizarre idea that they can release a bomb that will discharge female sex pheromones over the enemy forces. And that way, instead of fighting each other, they will be romantically attracted to each other. Of course, that did not happen. And this research and notion is largely ridiculed, not only for the bizarre idea that it has, as well as for the non effects of turning the combats gay or romanticized. One of the early studies, as we said, on human sexual behavior was done by Sir Alfred Kinsey. And the heterosexual homosexual rating scale that Dr. Kinsey proposed is popular by the name Kinsey scale. It says that a person's sexual behavior and probably orientation can range from being exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. And in between, there can be a wide range of bisexual orientation with variable degrees of heterosexuality and homosexuality. The scale does not suggest that we as individual can transition between these. It suggests that in a population there is a distribution of individuals among these categories. The drawback of this scale is that the scale did not identify asexuality, and that is why another category was later on added as asexual, where no sexual contact or reaction was found in those individuals. So, the fundamental question that ignites today's discussion is whether sexuality is a result of nature or nurture. It totally depends on the approach that we take to human psychology. The more biological and psychoanalytic approach we adopt, we move towards a gene related or biological or natural theory of sexuality. And the more we go to behavioral humanistic theories, we move gradually towards the nurture theories to explain that social conditioning is important in a person's sexuality. Having said this, so what is the scope of biological research on the causation or the origin of human sexuality? Please understand very clearly that academically it is actually very intriguing to understand the neural basis or genetic basis of sexuality. But discovering a gay gene does not necessarily validate any kind of sexual behavior. This is simply because heterosexuality as a normal behavior was not justified based on a heterosexual gene. It was by default accepted to be normal. And so there is, in comparison, there is no need for a gay gene or bisexual gene to prove that homosexuality or bisexuality is normal. That certain behaviors are genetic, for example, occurrence of cancer, does not prove that cancer is normal and desirable. Similarly, that certain behaviors are acquired, for example, the skill of language, does not prove that it is an abnormality or a wrong attribute for a person. So, understanding the genetic basis for academic purpose is always good. But using genetics to validate the existence of something is probably a wrong use of genetics. So, as doctors, when we look at the queer population in the medical campus, what is the general response? How does our current medical indoctrination treat sexuality? In a recent issue of the journal Academic Pediatrics, Dr. Mark A. Schuster, head of the General Pediatrics, says that there is an experience that people have to constantly choose between being a doctor and being openly gay, with a notion that gay people cannot be good doctors. So there is a representation of homosexuality or bisexuality as a pathology even today, after the decriminalization and demedicalization back in 1973. In the first year, when we study the physiology curriculum, there is no mention of the difference between gender and sex. There is no discussion on sexual orientation, homosexuality, or bisexuality. And there is also no discussion on gender identity. If you look at the standard textbooks of physiology, you will see that they reinforce on the stereotypes of heteronormativity. In Ganong's physiology, the characteristics of puberty in boys is described as the boys should be more aggressive with active attitude with interest in opposite sex. It clearly defies the other gender roles and other sexual orientation that a person can normally develop, thus imprinting in the mind of the student that homosexuality or gender dysphoria is an intrinsic pathology. In local textbooks that we often find students to read, you will see that the mention of same-sex behavior only comes in the context of brain damage. Again, implying that it is brain damage that causes same-sex kind of orientation rather than as a normal variation. In the second year, when students are exposed to the study of forensic medicine, we find a lot of bias being continued from archaic times. You will see in the book, the popular book by Reddy, that offenses, sexual offenses, are classified into natural, unnatural, and perversions. What is very interesting is rape has been considered to be a natural offense. Just because in the Indian Penal Code, rape is characteristically heterosexual rape, and because it's penovaginal in nature, it is characterized as natural, thus normalizing the culture of rape. On the other hand, consensual sodomy, consensual buccal coitus, and of course consensual masturbation is considered to be either offense or perversion. If you read through the excerpt in Dr. Reddy's book, page 351 reads like this. I am reading this out to show you how the study is not at all referenced. It's a particular way of writing your own opinion and making it sound like it is science. Female homosexuality is known as tribadism or lesbianism. Many lesbians are masculine in type. See, again, there is a great deal of confusion between sexual orientation and gender identity. This is definitely not a stereotype lesbian identity, possibly because of endocrine disturbances. Again, no study proves that endocrine disturbances cause lesbianism. and are indifferent towards individual of opposite sex. I mean, that's quite obvious. That is why they are called lesbian. They are indifferent towards individuals of opposite sex. That is not a pathology. That is the definition of lesbianism. The practice is usually indulged in by women who are mental degenerates or those who suffer from nymphomania. Again, you see how personal opinion becomes a component of a science textbook. And therefore, it starts influencing the younger minds who are reading about gender and sexuality for the first time. Lesbians who are morbidly jealous of one another when rejected may commit homicide, suicide, or both. Again, there is no reference to this. It is just something that the author feels like writing and writes without any kind of hesitation. Another excerpt mentions about the IPC 377, which has been very recently read down. Interestingly, the IPC 377 still finds its place in the forensic medicine books and is routinely asked in the examinations. Imagine there are gay, lesbian, and bisexual students in the medical colleges, and they have to write that they are abnormal in order to score marks. Another excerpt from the same book says homosexuality means persistent emotional and physical attraction to members of the same sex, which is correct. And then comes the opinion, which is unreferenced. As such, it is an abnormal personality development. Neither the DSM nor the International Classification of Disease, nor does any scientific body say that it is a personality development. It is seen as a normal variation of human sexuality, just like skin color. The author also describes how a medical examiner can identify a passive and active agent of sodomy by examining the anus and the penis respectively. The common element in both being presence of sexually transmitted diseases. So I hope you are understanding when I tell you that when a scientific information is conveyed to you, it is not always a pure elixir of science. It comes with the inherent prejudices, religious bias, and moral bias that the author holds in his or her mind. In the microbiology books, we get mention of the 3H club of HIV: the homosexuals, Hawaiians, and hemophiliacs. Just imagine the kind of discrimination it causes by mentioning certain communities as a club of HIV. Gay sex and not unprotected sex is mentioned as a risk factor for sexually transmitted infections and the HIV infection. In community medicine, you will see the books are not that biased. But the problem is that the book uses the word MSM, that is, men who have sex with men, synonymous with people who are gay. The problem is the word MSM was discovered for statistical studies on sexual behavior. They are not sexual identity of an individual. But when you use the word MSM synonymous with the word gay, people start believing that the only job that these people do, is to have sex with other men. So, in summary, you understand that you become aware of the dangers of homosexuality while heterosexuality remains imprinted in the mind as default, as normal, and as a safe sexuality. If you look at the syllabus of medicine proposed by the West Bengal University of Health Sciences, the only mention of sexuality is under disorders of sex and reproduction. Normal sexuality is not discussed. In the total syllabus of psychiatry, the only mention of sexuality is sexual dysfunction and puerperal psychosis. The mention of homosexuality in Harrison comes in 6 chapters: HIV, STI, Kaposi's sarcoma, anal cancer, hepatitis B, and syphilis. So you can understand the kind of subconscious imprinting that these books will do in your mind when you read about homosexuality. What we are not taught in the word is how to address queer individuals, how to address in a gender neutral language. In which word, male or female, should we admit a gender non conforming person or a trans person? The concept of gender neutral washroom is not there. And also, the regional and vernacular vocabulary of LGBTQ identities like Hijra, Koti, these are not taught. So the history taking becomes extremely difficult for queer individuals. We will also see that the medical colleges have a colonial hangover when it comes to the dressing sense. So the males have to be appropriately European males and the females have to be appropriately Indian females. So there is no scope of non-normative uh, students to express themselves in a medical college. That is also reflected in the way they deal with the patients. There are scopes of using inclusive vocabulary. So instead of men and women, we can use everyone. Instead of wife or husband, we can use spouse. Instead of he or she, we can use they or them. Instead of sister or brother, we can use the word sibling. Instead of using Mr., Mrs., Miss, we can use MX. Instead of male and female, we can use human. Instead of girls and boys, we can use the word kids. And instead of his or her, we can use their, even as a singular. This has been reflected also in the Hippocrates Oath. In the modern version of the Hippocrates Oath, you will see that it clearly mentions about not discriminating between the patients based on gender and sexual orientation. But this is not something that is highlighted during the oath taking ceremony. So instead of just criticizing the way the science is taught to us, let us try to take home the art of taking a sexual history. And in this second part of today's episode, we are going to discuss how a proper sexual history can be elicited in a less jargoned and less judgmental way. Let us take, for example, a case where a boy comes to you with some kind of a sexual problem. You have to set a stage for the discussion, you have to do the greeting, and then decide whether you write or do not write. The ideal stage is a private room where there is adequate privacy. The greeting is best done with a non gendered word. Hi and hello is good enough. And it's always good not to write in the beginning to make the person less conscious, and then start writing when the person starts becoming more and more comfortable with you. The typical history sheet usually has these attributes: the identifying data, chief complaint, history of present illness, history of past illness, family history, personal history, medical and treatment history. Then what is so special about a sexual history taking, and how do those attributes fit into these domains? So when you ask a patient in psychiatry, it's very important that you do not interrupt. Let the person speak freely. But when you think that the person is going astray, you can interrupt and bring the person back to the tracks. What's important is to hear the unspoken words. There may be many things that the patient wants to tell you but is not able to tell you. Say, for example, Nitin is a 17-year-old boy from Kolkata, and this is what Nitin tells you. You are the physician, and Nitin comes to you with this complaint. Doctor, my problem is that I'm getting thinner and weaker day by day. Previously, I used to play and work a lot, but now all my energy seems to be drained. My sleeps are disturbed, I don't feel hungry, and of late there has been a lot of nightfalls. I'm losing energy even when I'm not thinking of sex. It's coming out in the urine too. So, what do we learn from here? We ask ourselves, what is bothering Nitin the most? What is his idea about the cause and nature of the problem? And what is his idea and expectation about the treatment that we are going to give? Obviously, Nitin has a masturbatory guilt. He feels guilty of masturbation. And yeah, this gives rise to this popular conception of the Hutt syndrome in the Indian subculture. Nitin continues to speak. Yes, it is true that I had engaged in such bad practices earlier. It did not affect me then. Then I heard from a friend that masturbation may cause serious health problems, and I quitted immediately. Then the current problem started a month later, and I'm growing weaker day by day. Now it comes out even when I pass urine or stool. I just hope I stop losing energy like this. Please give me some energy pills to get back my strength. Now, if we critically analyze the version that Nitin is presenting us with, the words engaged and bad practices definitely indicate that he does not understand masturbation as a physiological process. To him, it is a bad practice. So there is a bit of guilt there. He also heard from a friend that masturbation may be dangerous. So there is a kind of peer pressure on him. And he quitted immediately, meaning that he is convinced that it is bad for the health. He just hopes to stop losing energy, which means he equates the concept of semen with energy. And he also does not recognize passing semen in urine as normal. So you can see the concept of spermatoria that was introduced way back in the early 90s is being still transmitted culturally into us. So what is the disease model that we are talking about? So there are peer culture and media influences and self-interpretation that cause a false fear and wrong knowledge about masturbation. So the person stops masturbating. But the normal synthesis of semen will continue and therefore it will outflow as nightfall or dhat. And this causes anxiety and somatic problem. As it flows out more and more, there is more self-interpretation as loss of energy. And the friends and popular culture also tell that person that what you are doing is a sin or is something bad. And therefore, it leads to something that we call a Dhat syndrome, a syndrome of misinterpretation of the normal masturbatory habit. In a nutshell, when you take a sexual history, we have to explore the sexual behavior, the sexual orientation, and the sexual identity. But our approach has to be non jargon because the patient may not know the terminologies. So, the basic steps are you ensure privacy. See that the person is not afraid to speak out the heart. Build up a good rapport. Take the sexual history as part of the general medical history without giving much emphasis. Don't make the person conscious that now I am starting to take a sexual history. That will make the person very unduly conscious. Use common sense to decide when is the right time to ask. So look at the body language of the patient. Look at the facial expression. When you feel that the patient has started to trust you, ask the questions that can be confidential. If culturally the person is not used to the word sex, you can use the word romance or love for patients who feel uncomfortable. Do not use technical words like orientation, sexual health, safe sex, barrier method. Use specific simple words for that. For example, you can start by asking questions like this. Nitin, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your health. So you start with regular chief complaint negative history. Do you get headaches, stomach aches? So how is your bowel habit? Do you have any problem with passing urine? And then you mention whether there is any problem in the sexual organ. Don't use the word sexual organ. Use a culturally appropriate term if needed. You blend this question with other questions. Do you smoke or do you drink? What's your pastime hobby? So these things will give you a clue to the sexual history as part of the general medical history. Now proceed to take the history of sexuality. So you can start by saying, like, people have romantic relations as they grow up. So when is the last time you remember being in one? And with whom? Are you currently in any relationship with a boy or girl? So ask in such a way that being in relationship with either boy or girl is equally normal. So your question should be normalized. Otherwise, you will not get the real answer. And then you can ask, oh, that's nice. May I know the name? This is also an attempt to know the orientation. You can add by saying, so what do you like in that person? This gives a human face to the relationship. Maybe the last question is not needed, but it also makes the person feel that he or she is not being viewed as a sexual case. He or she is being viewed as an emotional human being. Now proceed to ask more detailed questions. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions related to sex? When is the last time that you had sex? With whom did you have? And this gives you a clue to the behavior and also probably to the orientation. How often do you get a chance to meet? And where do you meet? This also tells you about the safety of the procedure. Is it a hurried sexual activity by the side of a park? Or is it a safer, more secure sexual practice that can be practiced inside a room? Then again, since the chief complaint was related to masturbation, so you assess the associated guilt. Boys masturbate as they grow up. So how often do you get a chance to masturbate? And if you feel appropriate, then you ask, whom do you think of while masturbating? Any particular boy or girl? You know, this is an interesting question in psychiatry, and this is called masturbatory fantasy. Masturbatory fantasy is a strong indication of the sexual orientation. So, when a person is thinking of a particular sex, male, female, or both, during masturbation, chances are that the person is attracted to that particular sex. Now, proceed to ask question about the safety. Do you think you need to use condoms while having sex? Do you use condoms? Have you ever had sex in a way that you regretted later, like not using condoms or getting physical with a not so well known person? So now you have enough information not only on the sexual orientation but also on the sexual behavior. If appropriate, you can also ask, did you ever feel that your sexual feelings are different from other boys? This is also a clue to the sexual orientation. It's also important to know that the patient may not reveal all information in the first meeting. So you may need more time for the person to feel comfortable. Now you end up again, dilute this again with general medical history. So you had said you often have constipation. How much water do you drink in a day? How is your sleep? How is your appetite, etc., etc. So you know that this is how the sexual history can become an integrated part of the history of present illness and past illness. It doesn't have to become a separate uh, portion where a person feels embarrassed to answer specific questions. The need for knowing sexual orientation and behavior is not always necessary. But if the symptoms are sexual in nature, it's important to know because many a times people with a non-heterosexual orientation feel highly discouraged to discuss about their sexuality. It is also important because a person whose sexual orientation is not accepted in the family or society might be more prone to unsafe behavior because they will not be able to marry in a conventional sense of the term or get an approval of having sex with the person of the same sex. So, for the safety of the person, it's very important that you know this. So, in summary, biological sex and gender identity are two different attributes. Although a lot of study has been done on neurology, a lot of study has been done on genetics, but till date there is no proven biological marker of sexual orientation or gender identity. Homosexuality or bisexuality is neither a disorder nor a perversion. They are normal variants of human sexuality. And the role of a physician is to support and spread awareness about the diversity of human sexual orientation and treat all individuals as equal. So this was today's presentation. Let us try to answer the questions that we started with. First question. A child is born with a pair of testes as primary sexual organ. What is the correct statement regarding that child? Wonderful. So the only thing we can say from this information is the biological sex of the child is male. Nothing else can be interpreted from. If an individual is born with ovaries and feels that she is a girl, then she can be described as. Very good. She can be described as being cisgender. A 12-year-old boy is romantically and physically attracted to boys only. He visits your clinic for his confusion. What is the best step to do? Wonderful. A and B are wrong because there is no biological marker for sexual orientation. And C is definitely not true. Sexuality is no one's passing phase in life. So we have to assure him that there is nothing wrong with him. Homosexuality is considered to be a developmental disorder by World Health Organization. True or false? Yes, this is false. Way back in 1990s, it has been declassified from the International Classification of Diseases. We may normalize homosexuality if we can discover a gay gene. Is it true or false? This again is false because we don't use genetics for validation of any sexuality.